All right, so today we are going to be doing a deep dive into a pretty fascinating, maybe even a little bit icky topic, disgust.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, when they think about disgust, they think about, kind of the obvious stuff like moldy food or creepy crawlies.
Yeah.
But as I'm sure you know, it goes way deeper than that.
Oh, yeah. It's so much more than that. It really gets into how we relate to other people,
Yeah,
to our morals, like how we see ourselves even.
absolutely.
It's really interesting.
So to guide us through this kind of messy, sometimes misunderstood world, we've got some really cool research on how disgust plays out in relationships.
Yeah.
There's this case study about this woman, we'll just call her F,
Okay.
who feels disgusted by her husband, even though, from what I can tell, he seems like a pretty decent guy.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what's really going on there.
It's a great example of how disgust can become distorted and then lead to problems in relationships.
But before we get into that, let's rewind a little bit and talk about the basics. Why do we even have disgust in the first place?
Well, from a survival perspective, disgust is our warning system. Think of it as your body's way of going danger
Right.
whenever there's something potentially harmful, like rotten food or contaminated water.
You're saying it's our ancestors' way of going, nope, don't eat that. You'll probably get sick.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's so deeply ingrained in us that there are universal reactions to it.
Yeah.
Think about that ick sound or the face you make when you smell something really foul, or even the gag reflex.
Everyone does it.
It's like a universal language of revulsion.
What's interesting is the source talks about how we can feel disgust empathetically. Like, if I see you recoil from something, I might start feeling a little grossed out too,
Right.
even if I don't even know what it does.
Yeah, and that makes sense from a survival standpoint. By seeing other people be disgusted, we can learn what to avoid
Right.
without having to experience the harmful thing ourselves.
It's social learning through disgust. Our ancestors see someone eat a poisonous berry and get sick. Everyone else is like, okay, noted, berry bad.
Exactly.
So it starts as this basic survival tool, but it can both expand and decontract.
Right.
What does that mean?
It means our disgust responses aren't set in stone.
Okay.
They can change based on what we experience, and the cultures that we live in. So think about a teenager with like oily hair and acne. Some people might be like, ugh.
Yeah.
Some people might not even think twice.
Right.
So is that disgust response innate, like the one we have toward rotten food?
Right.
Or is it something that we learn?
Right.
There's probably a mix of both.
Yeah.
Our genes definitely give us a baseline, but we also learn from our families and society what to be disgusted by. And this is where the concept of expanding and contracting comes in.
So give me an example. How does disgust expand?
Well, think about things like immoral behavior or social taboos or even certain political ideologies.
Right.
So our initial disgust response, which was just about avoiding physical contamination, that can actually get broadened to include things that we perceive as morally wrong or socially unacceptable.
So like things we might call morally disgusting
Right.
can actually trigger that same gut feeling as a pile of garbage.
Precisely. And it's not just individuals, but entire societies
Right.
can actually cultivate disgust towards certain groups or behaviors
Wow.
to enforce social norms and maintain some kind of order.
But isn't that a little unsettling?
Sure.
Like, if disgust is supposed to protect us from harm, but it gets expanded to include things that aren't actually dangerous,
Yeah,
doesn't that create some room for misuse?
that's a good point. And it leads to that concept of weaponized disgust, which
Yeah.
we're going to talk about in a bit. But first, how about we talk about how it contracts?
Okay, yes. Give me an example.
Think about surgeons or nurses. Their jobs require them to interact with things that would typically elicit strong disgust responses.
Right. Of
But
course.
they have to manage those feelings to effectively care for their patients.
They can't exactly just run out of the operating room if things get a little messy,
Oh.
so they train themselves to not be so sensitive to it.
Right. And
Okay.
this just goes to show how adaptable disgust really is. It's not entirely fixed, which, like you said, means it can be manipulated.
All right, so let's talk about weaponized disgust. What does that look like?
It's essentially using that visceral revulsion to manipulate people's opinions and behaviors. The source gives a couple stark examples. There's the case of an Israeli rabbi who used disgust language to demonize homosexuals, claiming that their homes stink
Yeah.
and that they're contaminating society.
Yeah, it's pretty clear he's not talking about a literal smell there. He's using disgust to dehumanize an entire group of people.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this isn't limited to just fringe groups or individuals. The source also talks about how Donald Trump frequently used disgust rhetoric during his presidency,
Yeah.
calling his opponents and their policies disgusting and nasty
Yeah.
to try and trigger feelings of revulsion in his supporters.
So he's tapping into people's natural disgust response and using it as like a political tool.
Precisely.
Okay.
And it can be really effective because disgust is a really powerful emotion. It can shut down rational thought and make people act impulsively, even aggressively.
It makes me think of those old propaganda posters that depicted enemies as rats or insects. Like they were literally trying to make people disgusted by the other side.
Exactly.
So it's disgust being used to manipulate us on a subconscious level.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
And to understand how it works, you have to look at the different ways people use disgust. Lieberman and Patrick, who the source quotes, they break it down into 4 main categories.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued.
Wow.
What are they?
So the first is identifying threats. And this is that basic evolutionary function we've talked about. Think rotten food,
Right.
contaminated water, anything that could hurt us physically.
Pretty straightforward. What's the next one?
The second is signaling morality.
Oh.
This is where disgust gets tied to our values and beliefs.
Hmm.
So we might express disgust at things we deem morally wrong,
Okay.
like lying or cheating or cruelty.
So like when I say I'm disgusted by your actions, it's like I'm saying your actions violate my moral code.
Exactly. It's a way of kind of showing our moral boundaries
All right.
and what we find acceptable or not.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the third category?
The third one is influencing others. And this is where weaponized disgust really comes into play. It's about using disgust to try and shape other people's opinions, manipulate their behavior, even control them.
Like the examples we were just talking about with the rabbi and Donald Trump. They're trying to influence people's beliefs and actions through disgust.
Exactly. And the fourth and final category is social avoidance or exclusion. This is using disgust to create distance between ourselves and others, often to maintain social hierarchies or reinforce group identities.
It's like the us versus them mentality.
Right.
We're the good, clean ones, and they're the contaminated, disgusting ones.
You got it. And that can have some pretty serious consequences, leading to prejudice and discrimination, even violence.
This is all pretty eye-opening. It makes you wonder how much of our disgust is really our own and how much of it has been shaped by these external forces.
That's a really great question, and it's something we'll continue to explore as we go deeper into this topic.
Yeah, and I definitely want to circle back to F and her husband. You know, the woman who's disgusted by her husband, even though he seems to bend over backwards to accommodate her.
Right. This is a perfect example of how disgust can be distorted and have a negative impact on relationships.
Like, is it really him she's disgusted by?
Yeah.
Or is there something else going on? What could she be protecting herself from?
Well, the source mentioned she has OCD, which can be tough.
Right.
And she relies on her husband and children to help manage her symptoms.
Right.
And that might lead to feelings of dependence, even shame.
Right.
So maybe she's taking those uncomfortable feelings and projecting them onto her husband,
Oh, I see.
making him the target of her disgust.
So it's easier to be disgusted by him than to confront those feelings within herself.
It's possible she's unconsciously creating distance
Yeah.
and avoiding those deeper emotional struggles by focusing on her disgust for him.
Almost like a reverse disgust response. Instead of disgust protecting her from something external,
Yeah,
it's protecting her from something internal.
exactly.
Okay.
And this highlights how complex disgust can be and how it shows up in these surprising ways
Right.
in relationships. And actually, the source contrasts F's situation with another case study
Okay.
with a young woman named D.
All right. Tell me about D. How is her situation different?
Well, unlike F, whose disgust response seems to be overactive, D actually had a diminished disgust response
Okay.
because of how she was raised.
So you're saying disgust can be both overactive and underactive.
Yes, and both extremes can have negative consequences. So
Yeah.
in Dee's case, her family dynamics ended up suppressing her natural disgust responses, which made her vulnerable
You're right.
to exploitation and manipulation.
Really powerful example of how our early experiences can shape our emotions, even something like disgust,
Right.
which seems so basic. Makes you realize disgust isn't just about avoiding bad smells or whatever.
Yeah.
It's about our sense of self, our morality, how we connect with other people. Have you ever seen this play out in your own life? Relationships where disgust, even in subtle ways, played a role.
I think we all have to some
Yeah.
extent. Disgust can be a powerful force for good and bad.
Yeah.
And really understanding it is essential for navigating our social world
Absolutely.
and our own emotional well-being. And that's what we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so stay tuned as we delve even deeper into this surprisingly complex and fascinating world of disgust. So, welcome back to our deep dive into disgust. So far, we've talked about, where disgust comes from, how it can expand to include morality,
Right.
and how it can even be used as a weapon to manipulate people. But now I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and look at some alternative perspectives.
Oh.
Remember how we were talking about disgust getting tied to morality, like how something can be morally disgusting?
Yes.
I'm really curious to dig into that more.
Well, the source introduces this concept called moral disgust,
Moral disgust. Okay.
which takes that connection between disgust and morality even further.
Okay.
And mentions this book, Brain Talk,
Mm-hmm.
by David Sinesh. He says that moral disgust isn't just a feeling.
Okay.
It's actually a compass for ethical behavior.
Okay.
He suggests that, like, when we feel disgust towards something that's morally reprehensible,
Right.
it's a sign that our internal moral compass is working correctly.
So instead of disgust being this primitive ew reaction,
Right.
it can actually help guide us towards making good choices.
Exactly. And Sinesh even proposes that some people who've experienced trauma might actually have a diminished moral disgust response.
Like if you grow up in an environment where moral boundaries are constantly being violated, your sense of what's morally disgusting could be dulled.
Right, as a way of coping with that trauma.
It's like your brain going, okay, if I want to survive here, I need to turn down the volume on my moral disgust alarm.
Precisely.
That's heavy.
Yeah, and this is where his work gets really interesting.
Okay.
He says that therapy can actually help restore healthy moral disgust responses in people who've been through trauma.
Okay.
It's about kind of reawakening that internal compass
Right.
and strengthening those ethical boundaries.
Makes me think back to Dee, the woman we talked about before, whose disgust response was like really low because of her family. Do you think this approach could have helped her? Like, could it have given her the tools to, recognize and reject that exploitation she was going through?
It's certainly possible.
Yeah.
By working through her trauma and getting her sense of moral disgust back on track,
Right.
she might be able to protect herself better. And this actually brings us back to F
Okay.
and her husband.
Yes.
It's really behind her disgust for him.
Right.
We've talked about so much
Yeah.
evolutionary disgust, social disgust, moral disgust,
It's complicated.
but we still don't have a clear answer for her case.
Yeah, and keep in mind, we only have limited information here.
Right.
But the source suggests that her disgust might not be about him at all. It might be about her own struggles, her dependence on him, and maybe even, shame.
So she's taking those feelings and putting them on him,
Exactly.
making him the scapegoat
Right.
for her own issues.
It's like she's saying, I can't deal with these feelings inside me, so I'm going to make you, my husband, the problem.
Yeah.
It's so sad for both of them. He's trying to be there for her, and she's pushing him away with disgust.
It's really tough.
It makes me wonder about him, though.
Okay.
Could his acceptance of her behavior actually be a sign that he's suppressing his own disgust?
That's an interesting question.
Like maybe he's so used to pushing down his feelings that he doesn't even realize how unhealthy this is.
Yeah.
Maybe he learned that it's just better to go along with things, even if they make him uncomfortable.
It's possible that his past has taught him to put up with, a certain level of mistreatment.
Yeah.
Maybe even to the point where he thinks it's normal, or even that he deserves it.
Wow, this is getting deep.
Ugh.
But it's really insightful. We tend to think of disgust as this, simple emotion.
Right.
But the more we talk about it, the more I realize how complex it really is.
Absolutely. There are so many layers to it, and they all connect to something bigger.
Okay, so we've talked about F's possible reasons for her disgust. But I also want to think about how all this might be affecting him. We've said he might be suppressing his disgust,
Yeah.
but what could that actually lead to?
Well, holding back any emotion, especially disgust, which is so strong,
Right.
can have serious consequences.
Yeah.
Psychological and physical.
Yeah.
It can lead to resentment, anger, even depression.
Wow.
It can also show up as physical symptoms like headaches or digestive issues,
Really?
even insomnia.
So it's not just an emotional burden, it can actually make him sick.
Exactly. And in his case, constantly suppressing his disgust might be making him feel powerless.
Okay.
Like he has low self-esteem.
Mm.
He might feel trapped in the relationship. Like he can't express his needs.
It's like this awful cycle. She pushes him away with disgust, and he feels trapped and resentful because he's holding back.
It really shows you how important it is to recognize and address these unhealthy patterns.
Mm.
Both partners need to feel like they can be honest about their emotions, even the tough ones.
Like that saying, what you resist persists. If you try to bury your emotions, they'll find a way to come out, whether it's through your body or your behavior.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about moral disgust,
Right.
how therapy might help people restore their disgust response,
Mm-hmm.
and the complex dynamics of disgust in F and her husband's relationship.
Right.
But is there any way for them to break out of this?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Can their relationship be saved?
Well, that's something only they can figure out.
Of course.
And it'll probably take a lot of soul-searching, communication, maybe even professional help.
Right.
But the first step is for them to acknowledge the elephant in the room. They have to see that disgust is playing a role in their relationship.
It's like they need to call it out, not dance around it.
Yeah,
Disgust is here, and it's hurting us.
exactly. Once they can admit that,
Mm-hmm.
they can start to understand where it's coming from and how it's affecting them.
And maybe by understanding disgust better, they can start to heal.
It's a journey worth taking for them and for anyone dealing with the complexities of disgust.
Okay, so we've covered a lot,
Co-wave.
from the origins of disgust to how it can be twisted and distorted. We even looked at this real-life case study and talked about how therapy might help, but I feel like there's still so much more to explore.
There is.
In the last part of our deep dive, we'll bring all of this back to the bigger picture and look at how disgust shapes our views of other people and how we act in the world. Stick with us, listeners, for the final part of our exploration into the wild world of disgust. All right, so welcome back. We've been on this really interesting journey exploring disgust, going all the way back to like its evolutionary roots and then to how it can be manipulated.
I see fascinating how something, that we usually think about in terms of like bad smells
Right.
can have such a huge impact on society.
It's like this hidden language that shapes how we see everyone, how we see the world.
Exactly. And remember how the source talked about how disgust can be used to like create distance between people. It's not just about like personal preferences. It's about creating those us versus them categories.
Like with the rabbi using that disgust language about homosexuals, or
Right.
even the way Trump talked about his opponents, it's all about making those groups seem like contaminated, dangerous, even just wrong.
Exactly. And that's a tactic, unfortunately, that's been used throughout history
Right.
to justify discrimination, even violence.
Mm-hmm.
The source specifically mentions, the Nazis
Yeah.
and how they used disgust in their propaganda
Oh, yeah.
to dehumanize Jews, to make them seem like vermin
Right.
or disease carriers.
Yeah.
It's a scary reminder of how disgust can be twisted and used for evil.
If you can make people think that something is disgusting, you can kind of bypass their logic and tap into those primal fears, those things. And once you've done that,
It's scary.
it's so much easier to turn people against each other.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. Because once you start seeing these patterns, you see them everywhere. It's not just in extreme cases like the Nazis.
Right.
It's in the way people talk about immigrants, the homeless, even people with different political views.
It's like these micro disgusts, these subtle things we might not even realize we're doing, but they have this huge impact on how we see the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to like thinking critically and being aware of ourselves.
Yeah.
We have to question our own disgust responses.
Mm.
Where are they coming from? Are they about real threats, or are they just because of how we were raised, or even because someone's trying to manipulate us?
It's like we need to be able to, I don't know, read disgust,
Yeah,
to decode it and understand what's really going on.
I like that, disgust literacy.
Mm.
And by doing that, we can be more aware, more compassionate,
Right.
and less likely to be tricked by it. We can start to break down those walls between us and them, Remember that we're all human.
So we've covered a lot. We've gone deep into disgust, from where it comes from to how it can be used against us. We looked at a real case, talked about therapy. But for the listener, what does it all mean? How can they use this to, to live better?
The biggest takeaway, I think, is that disgust is powerful, but it doesn't always tell the whole story.
Okay.
It's shaped by so many things: evolution, our own experiences, culture, even politics.
Right.
It's not as simple as just, avoiding stuff that's gross. It's
Right.
about understanding those reactions and making smarter choices.
It's not just about what we do it's about why we do it.
Exactly. A good first step is just being aware of our own reactions.
Yeah.
Pay attention when you feel that sense of disgust. Ask yourself, why am I feeling this? Is it a real threat or is it something else?
And if it is something else, if it's prejudice or like someone messing with our heads, we
Right.
can actually fight back. We don't have to let it control us.
By really understanding disgust, we can be more in control of our lives, more understanding of others, and we can build a better world.
Well, that's a great way to end this.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into disgust. Hopefully it's given you a lot to think about.
One last thought. If disgust can be used to divide us, could we also use it for good?
Interesting.
Could we use it to fight injustice, to protect people, to make a more caring society? Something to think about as we keep exploring all these fascinating human emotions. Until next time.